The five men who took part in the gang rape of a 17-year-old schoolgirl in the Midlands were handed sentences in the Central Criminal Court yesterday. Those sentences were 20 years, 18 years, 15 years, 7 years, all with the final year suspended. One of the men had the final 2 years of his 12-year sentence suspended, probably because he pleaded guilty at the 11th hour. For more on this, I'm joined on the line by Newstalk's courts correspondent Frank Rainey. Good morning, Frank.
Good morning, Pat.
The sentences handed down have been welcomed as to their severity, but can you give us the background to this case?
I will, and as always, I'll tread carefully, Pat, because as I'm sure you and your listeners be very familiar at this point, now this was a very distressing case, a very disturbing case. In fact, I can safely say it's the worst, the most depraved rape trial that I've covered in the Central Criminal Court, and I don't think anyone who covered the case or who was there throughout hasn't been affected by it in some way. And it goes back to the early hours of December 27th, 2016. The girl was 17 at the time. She'd been out with some friends. They had celebrated St. Stephen's Day together. Some of them had been away and returned to Tullamore, and they were catching up essentially. Had a few drinks, but nothing excessive. We heard that she dropped her phone that night, so it wasn't working properly on the night. And at the end of the night, after they flooded out of a nightclub, they all decided to go for food. But she actually became separated from her friends at this point because she wanted to get her takeaway from another establishment. Afterwards, she tried to get a taxi home. She couldn't, so she decided to walk it. We heard that she was on her own, that a car pulled up, and that she heard her name being called. So she assumed, and it was a fair assumption to make, that it was her friends coming to give her a lift home, but she soon realised after getting into the car that it wasn't, as she didn't recognise any of the boys. And I can only imagine the terror that she must have felt when the reality of her situation dawned on her. There were 5 boys in the car, all aged between 17 and 19 at the time. She was told to lie across the laps of the 3 boys in the back of the car for fear that the guards might pass and see how many people were in the car. And that's when her nightmare truly began, because we heard that one of the boys started touching her in the back of the car. She tried to push this boy's hand away. The guy in the front passenger seat then noticed her distress and invited her to come into the front of the car, and she sat on his lap to get away from the other boys. But this guy then started to sexually assault her, and as he was sexually assaulting her, we heard her describe how hands were coming at her from the back of the car. The driver got involved at this stage as she pleaded with them to take her home. They didn't. They drove her through some back roads to a remote location in Kilbeggan, where they got out of the car, and then 3 of them, one by one, got back into the car. We heard horrific evidence from her about how they took turns raping her. She said that she felt paralysed. She just froze. She was terrified. She said there were also flashes outside the car which suggested to her that she was being recorded, that these events were being recorded by the boys who were outside the car waiting to come in. That added to her distress. That added to the trauma that she has experienced over the past few years. They all eventually got back into the car. We heard a couple of them were then dropped off, and she was taken by the others to another location. She thought she was being taken home. At this point, she wasn't. She was taken to a car park where she was raped and assaulted again. This time, she described how she desperately tried to get out of the car, but she was stopped by 2 of them. So there were false imprisonment charges brought in relation to the 2 of them, and they were convicted of those charges. They did eventually let her go, and CCTV was shown during the trial of her running hysterically through that car park. She managed to get to a friend's house. There were a number of friends at this house. They were obviously very concerned for her, and they brought her to the guards, and that's when the investigation. In fact, there was a knock at one of the boys' doors just an hour later, so that's when the investigation, the prosecution really began.
Now, this all happened on the evening of St. Stephen's Day into the early hours of the 27th of December 2016. It is 2022 when this gets to court. The delay seems to me, given that the investigation started so early and it was reasonably conclusive as to the perpetrators very early on, why does it take so long for this to get to court?
It's truly incredible, isn't it? And it really adds to the trauma for everyone, particularly the young woman in this case, again, just 17 years at the time, in her early 20s now, and she has had to wait the best part of the last 6 years for her justice. Now, obviously, between now and 2016, late 2016, we've obviously been in the throes of pandemic, and that has affected the court system. There were various points during lockdowns where there were no juries being called to hear criminal trials. Clearly, this trial required a jury. So that would have had an effect. It created a backlog of about 2 years for all of these types of cases. But it's still, despite that, it's still far too long, and I was reminded of one of the things that was said in mitigation in relation to one of the defendants, where, they had said that this has been hanging over them for so many years, and they used the delay in getting the case to court as a mitigating factor. Now, the judge did reject that, and rightly so. And the reason she rejected that was, her argument was, well, what about this young woman? This young woman has been waiting 5 or 6 years. So, pandemic aside, it still took quite a while to get this to trial. Justice in this country, as we all know, the wheels turn very slowly. But she did get her day in court. It was a very difficult trial. It went on for 4.5 weeks. She gave extensive evidence. She was cross-examined throughout. She was, in her words, in her victim impact statement, she described how she was badgered about when exactly she said stop. She was asked questions about why didn't you fight back, and she described that all as very, very difficult. But she did get her justice in the end. One of the men pleaded guilty to rape, and the other 4 were convicted of various charges in relation to it.
Now, the sentences, they were, I suppose, at the upper end of what we have come to expect from rape trials. But, of course, this was a gang rape, so there was, if you like, a conspiracy among the young men to do all of this. But one of them, Conor Byrne, pleaded guilty, and he got a lower sentence. But I always thought that you get a lower sentence because you plead guilty early. He did not plead guilty early.
He didn't know. It was the 11th hour. It was past the 11th hour. The trial had actually begun. I think there were 2 days in. There was some evidence of photographs and maps were being shown to the jury when he decided to change his plea. And he did plead in the end to rape. So that jury was discharged, and another jury was required to hear the trial then for the remaining defendants. Now, it was at the 11th hour, so he wasn't entitled to the full discount that one would get if they pleaded at an earlier stage. But the judge did consider it very valuable because it had taken place before the woman took the stand to give her evidence. It would have been incredibly wrong if that plea had come after that. That she would have had to get up and do all of that again, perhaps. So it saved her the stress of doing that.
Does it help the court and the prosecution when you have a number of men who are accused of rape, and they are, of course, pleading not guilty, 4 of the 5, but one is pleading guilty. So therefore, there is, if you like, an admission that a rape took place. And if each of them had sex with this young woman, they claimed consensually, but one of them says, yes, it was rape. Does that help the prosecution to advance the case more quickly?
No, not really. I mean, what it does from a practical sense is it saves time. So clearly they wouldn't have had to prove the case beyond a reasonable doubt in relation to Conor Byrne. But the jurors would have been warned ad nauseum throughout the trial and again thereafter that it was essentially 4 separate trials that were being run. So they would have had to look at each case individually. And just because Conor Byrne pleaded guilty to a very serious offence didn't really reflect any wrongdoing on the others. Obviously we don't know how the jurors arrived at their decisions in the end, but the evidence was very strong against the remaining men in the dock who were also convicted of, sexual assault offences. And there were 2, obviously, that were convicted of false imprisonment as well. But Conor Byrne's plea was valuable from the survivor's point of view because she felt validated. She felt believed. She had this hadn't just all been made up in her head. And she mentioned that in her victim impact statement as well. Like, she paid particular attention to Conor Byrne in her victim impact statement, which was delivered earlier this week. She turned to him directly, this was one of the four men who had raped her, the only one to admit it. And she turned to him and she said that he had did her a great wrong that night, but she said that finally he did the right thing by pleading guilty, albeit all of these years later. But she did appreciate the plea. She told him that she would never be the same person after what he and his friends did to her. But in time, she said that she did think that she would try to forgive him, but not the others. She wouldn't even refer to the others by name. And in return, she asked him not to let this be the defining moment of his life. Imagine that, Pat. She turned to him and she said, "Prove to others and yourself that you have learned from your wrongdoings and become a better person." And I think it's fair to say that the humility and decency of the woman to say that, given the circumstances, given what he had done to her, what he admitted doing to her, I thought that was an incredible act of generosity on her part.
Now, the woman said that she still recriminates with herself over what she called a stupid decision. But actually, it wasn't a stupid decision. It was something that anyone might do.
And that is one of the really tragic features of this case and of many rape cases that come before the Central Criminal Court, is that the survivor, and I'm loath to call this woman or anyone like her a victim, this woman is a survivor, and they do tend to blame themselves, which is a tragic knock-on effect because they've got nothing to blame themselves for. This was not of her doing. And the judge did point out at pains yesterday, she spoke to her on a number of occasions directly, and she said, "You are not to blame for what happened to you." She was there yesterday surrounded by family and friends, and she didn't address the court, but I've spoken about that victim impact statement, and she would have described herself at the time as somewhat innocent, and before the attack she said that she was a sociable, hardworking and a happy Leaving Cert student, and she blamed herself for leaving her friends, for being selective about the food that she wanted to eat after her night out, for getting into the car. She described how stupid that was, and she's still very clearly haunted by her decision to get in the car. But at the end of the day, this car had pulled up. Somebody had called her name. It was an innocent assumption, but I think we all would have assumed that no harm would have come of us, that somebody familiar to us was in that car. And the judge did point out yesterday too that this happened in a small country town where you would expect that even if they didn't know her, these were boys of her age, that they would still have brought her home safely. She could not have imagined what evil was going to visit her that night, and she certainly has nothing to blame herself for. What happened that night was pure evil, completely and utterly out of her hands. And I'm also reminded of that comment that she made in her victim impact statement about being badgered, about not fighting back, or at what point did you say stop? I mean, she gave evidence of being paralyzed and of freezing. And again, this is kind of a recurring theme that we're always talking about in relation to rape trials. And the judge commented on that yesterday, is that, a person doesn't have to be crying or shouting out to not consent to something. And it's certainly not up to the rapists to decide on consent. And they had claimed, incredibly, that the sexual activity that took place that night had been consented to. It absolutely hadn't. And thankfully, a jury agreed that that wasn't the case.
Now, counsel for some of the defendants, after the jury verdict came in, accepted that verdict and said that their clients were now remorseful. But of course, that was in advance of sentencing.
Yes, and actually not all of them have accepted the verdicts of the jury. And while the others did, a 22-year-old man, the driver, Marcos Vinicius De Silva Umbelino, he's from Riverview in Kilbeggan, and he got 14 years for sexual assault and rape. And he's the only one who doesn't actually accept the plea. He offered no apology or expression of remorse. So clearly he wouldn't have been given the same discount as the others would have got if he had accepted the jury's verdict, and if he had apologised, and if he did show some expression of remorse. We heard all of the others had penned letters of apology and were remorseful. And whether or not that's self-serving when it comes to sentencing, it's hard to tell. But certainly when it's lacking, it has an effect. Not only on the sentence eventually handed down, but certainly on, this woman's ability to move on. To think that somebody has been convicted of doing this heinous crime and doesn't apologise or show any expression of remorse. well, the judge certainly took that into consideration when she was crafting his sentence yesterday.
Now, the final year of 4 of the sentences was suspended. 2 years suspended from the sentence of one of the defendants. But how long are they likely to actually serve behind bars?
That really depends on them. They'll be entitled to the same remission as any other prisoner if they behave themselves behind bars. They've been handed lengthy sentence. There's no doubt about it. People are often, and rightly so, criticising the judicial system for some of the sentences that are handed down in rape cases. Again, you have to take these on a case-by-case basis. But if you look at the longest sentence that was handed down yesterday, that of 19 years to Gabriel Gomez da Roca, 19 years is a very long sentence. And the judge did say at points when she was giving out her reasoning for handing down sentences yesterday, she said it did cross her mind at times, particularly in relation to the man who raped her twice, that she did consider handing down a life imprisonment, which would have been the maximum penalty available to her for a conviction of rape. But again, taking some mitigating factors into account, she didn't quite go that far. But to put things into perspective, okay, Da Roca got 19 years. He's unlikely to serve 19 years if he behaves himself in prison. But the average sentence that a lifer gets or serves for a murder conviction is about 20 years. At this moment in time, it's about 20 years. So that puts things into perspective. These were very lengthy sentences handed down yesterday. The judge's comments as well, by the way, were absolutely incredible. Ms. Justice Tara Burns certainly didn't mince her words when she was handing down these sentences yesterday. She said that there wasn't a shred of humanity or respect in the actions of these boys. She said they acted like animals. She described the depravity and what they did as absolutely shocking. She said that the attacks involved degradation of the most extreme nature. She said women are not playthings. Consent isn't a decision for the rapist. And again, just because she doesn't shout or cry out doesn't mean that she's consenting. Some very, very strong commentary from the judge. And it was a really touching moment at the end when she actually addressed the woman directly just after the sentences were handed down. And it was a really lovely moment where she just told her that she didn't have the words. I don't have the words here today, to describe what she went through, what she's going through. But you do get the sense, particularly from that victim impact statement that she delivered earlier in the week, you do get the sense that this is a remarkably brave and incredibly strong woman. And you do get the feeling, especially with the loving family and very supportive friends that she has around her, that she will get over this, that she will move on with her life and put this behind her, that this won't define her. Yes, it will be a part of her story, but you do get the sense that it's not going to be the closing chapter. And also just in relation to that, these supportive friends that the judge mentioned yesterday, it is worth giving them a nod today. These were the young boys whose house she visited after running from the car park in hysterics at that night. They were the ones who tried to calm her down, listened to her, and went to the guards with her. And the judge described them as a beacon of hope because they would have been around the same age as the boys who picked her up that night. And it was just interesting to see the comparison, between that group of friends that she has and the group of boys that picked her up. That when the other group of boys saw this woman in distress, they took advantage of her being in a vulnerable situation, while the other young lads sought to comfort and help her. And I thought that was a really nice thing to mention and to reflect on afterwards.
Frank Rainey, Newstalk's courts correspondent, thank you very much.
Thanks, Pat.
And if you've been affected by anything discussed in this conversation, you can contact the Dublin Rape Crisis Centre National 24-hour helpline on 1800 77 8888.